Today, I spoke with two different homeowners who reached out looking to sell their homes. They both had similar problems, and that is they've moved out of town, and the big problem is they have tenants who've been in their homes for a very long time, between 10 and 20 years. In one case, they haven't raised the rent in 18 years. In the other case, the rent has been raised but very, very little each year. As a result, they're both way below market value. Let's discuss how this affects the price of a home. In one of the instances, the home was worth ARV, after repair value, around $500,000. And we figured we'd be able to buy it for about, it needed a lot of work, for about $350,000, putting work into it and then selling it and so on. We'd better make some money, and the homeowner got a fair price. But with the tenant in the house, there's something called a 1% rule. And we have to use that rule when there's a tenant. The 1% rule says or states that the monthly rent is equal to 1% of the purchase price. What that means is if you're collecting $2,200 a month rent, it's the value of the house is $220,000. And I just had this meeting with someone yesterday, and here I am today. I had two more. So I think I'm being a little repetitive, but it's so important to talk about. So, so we talked about, in both cases, will the tenants leave? And they both felt they can ask the tenants to leave, and they probably would. So again, if the tenants are willing to leave, you're better off selling a house without tenants 9 times out of 10, and I dare say 10 out of 10 times. Even if you're selling the house to somebody an investor who wants to rent it, most investors want to bring their own tenants in. They prefer not to have yours. So unless you have a spectacular tenant that's paying fair market rent, I highly recommend you remove your tenant. But as I said in a previous video, removing a tenant is not without its problems. You may have the best tenant, but once you ask them to leave, you are now the boogeyman. They may love you, think you've been wonderful. Once you ask them to leave, now suddenly you're mean, you're horrible, you're terrible. And they may not leave. They may stop paying you rent as a result. And now you're left with a house with a non-paying tenant. And now what's the value of the house? If they were paying $2,200 a month, is it still worth $220,000? No, not when the tenant's not paying. Here in downstate New York, evictions can take a year, 2 years, 3 years. I'm going through that right now. I have 4 tenants that owe me a combined amount of back rent of over $200,000. 4 families, four homes. So the courts are not in the favor of the landlord. So with that in mind, be careful if you're asking a tenant to leave, but also be aware if you're selling a home with a tenant, you're not going to get top dollar. Both these people felt while they're out of town and the market, so it's a great time to sell. A great time to sell for them would be when the tenant leaves. So my advice was, if the tenant's going to leave, great. If they're going to leave, if you ask them, great. But otherwise, just wait them out. And then even if the market drops going forward, which it might due to interest rates and so on, they still may be better off even in a lower market, but with no tenant, I think they'll make out better. So again, if you have a home with a tenant, number one, keep your rents up, raise rent every year. Your expenses go up every year. You have to raise your rent every year. And quite frankly, tenants expect it. So don't chip yourself by not doing that in 2 ways. One is on the monthly income, and 2 is by reducing the value of your house. Again, if you don't raise rent by $50 a month for 10 years, that's $500, right? That computes to a $50,000 difference in the value of the house. The $50 a month is small potatoes. It's the $50,000 that really hurts later on. So be very careful if you're a landlord, especially a small operator, where you tend to have a relationship with your tenants that's more friendly than professional. Keep a reasonable distance, keep a professional relationship with any of your tenants, and do what you've got to do as a business person. If you have a home to sell with a tenant in it or without a tenant in it, feel free to give us a call. We buy them either way.